Hello and welcome back to the Reading Corner. Today we are going to be looking at several books. So this is not going to be the in 15 minutes or less version, but we're going to be looking at key ideas and thoughts from libertarian thinkers and Austrian economists. I am going to break down the definition first of libertarianism and Austrian economics, and then we are going to look primarily at The Law by Frederic Bastiat and Principles of Economics by Carl Menger, and go into a couple other key thinkers from those schools. Hey guys, and also before we get into the definition of libertarianism and the definition of Austrian economics, I just want to say quickly that I am kind of changing my plans on this video. The Law is going to be a quick overview, and same with Principles of Economics. And I'm going to go more in depth in a blog post that I'll link to down below. But when you get to those sections of the video, don't be surprised if it's a little brief, because I can't go as in depth here on this video format as I really want to go with those books. So I'm just going to give a brief review of each and link to that more in-depth blog post down below. It's important to point out to start with libertarianism that there's a lot of different ways of thinking in a libertarian manner and a lot of ways to arrive at very similar conclusions. However, the central idea for all libertarians and the central principle is liberty. And libertarians believe, for the most part, in nonviolence, except in the cases of self-defense of someone else's person or your own person or your property or somebody else's property. And in doing so, they also believe that there's no exceptions to this non-aggression principle, do no harm to others. And that includes governments, which all often are an unjust monopoly on the use of force. And there are some libertarians who fall more in line of the camp of the government's job is to protect life, liberty, and property, these three fundamental rights laid out in the Declaration of Independence, laid out by Locke originally. But then there are other libertarians who fall more in line with an anarchist line of thinking, which would say no one really consents to the government. You can't consent to the government, in fact, and the government is really an unjust, illegal institution, and that society should just consist of completely voluntary interactions. Libertarians tend to fall somewhere between this minarchist and anarchist perspective. However, they all believe in liberty. They all believe usually in a free market and non-interventionist foreign policy, and open or private borders, in decriminalization of drugs, in a free market for money and for other commodities, and generally in leaving people alone within, what one of the candidates would say is leave people alone in their bedroom or in their houses, but also in their businesses. Taking a look from an economic standpoint, Austrian economics is a study of economics that believes in property rights and respect for individual liberty and voluntary association. Generally speaking, these economists will favor free markets, lack of central banking, and things of that sort. The Austrian School of Economics was started by Carl Menger, who we are going to talk about today, who got it started in Germany in around the 1850s. And he generally was ostracized to Austria, and that's why it took off on the form or the name of Austrian economics, and several of his students came later and expanded upon his thoughts. Some more modern Austrian economists include Ludwig von Mises, Frederick von Hayek. You can see a trend here, Henry Hazlitt, and Murray Rothbard are the American ones. And they all believed in voluntary association and free markets as the best possible way to bring about human flourishing, argued against government intervention in the economy, and generally against someone controlling the human and planning the human economy. And Murray Rothbard famously argued against this because the individual has the best knowledge about themselves, and that no one, especially on a daily basis when you make tons of choices, can make any of your choices better than you, who has the most direct knowledge of your own life. And so they wanted to get government out of making individual choices for other people. The first work we are really looking at in this video is The Law by Frederic Bastiat. And I have to say, when I first read this book, I was a little surprised at how bored I was, because I'd heard it was this great libertarian work. But what I've discovered since then is that this contains a lot of fundamental ideas that I had already understood at that point, so it wasn't adding a lot of value to me. But if you don't read this first, it might be a little dull to you. But if you want to know a lot of the very fundamental ideas and thoughts in libertarianism, then this is a great book for you. It is about the fundamental rights of life, liberty, and property, and how those rights are to be protected by government. Bastiat says that the government is an organized force to act as an obstacle to injustice. In a sense, it is justice. And really, government cannot go beyond those means and those boundaries without actually acting as an obstacle to justice, because we as an individual have the right to protect our life, liberty, and property, and to protect the life, liberty, and property of others. And that's what the law is the common force organized to do that. However, when it goes outside of those things, when it tries to enforce fraternity, when it tries to enforce religion or anything of that sort, then it is taking life, liberty, and property into its own hands. And I kind of want to just read a couple quotes here to let Bastiat's words speak for himself, rather than delving too deep into a summary of the whole entire text. And I think these quotes really summarize his main points very well. The first is what I already said. Law is the common force organized to act as an obstacle in justice. In short, law is justice. And then he says, a couple pages later, these are towards the end of the book, so he's kind of concluding his remarks. If you exceed this proper limit, if you attempt to make the law religious, fraternal, equalizing, philanthropic, industrial, literary, or artistic, you will then be lost in an uncharted territory, in vagueness and uncertainty, in a forced utopia, or even worse, in a multitude of utopias, each striving to seize the law and impose it upon you. I have to say, Menger's 1871 Principles of Economics volume was incredible to me. I really just sped through this book, which is a lot to say for an economics textbook. He just geniusly builds his lines upon each other, and he establishes several theories: the theory of goods, value, price, exchange, and commodity, and money. And all of these in succeeding order kind of build upon each other, although I think the most important is his theory of value, which is basically that value is subjective and it is worth what somebody thinks it's worth. And that is a very layman's way of saying that you know, how much somebody values it is how much it is worth. And that's a very layman's way of explaining his argument. But I think I'm going to read a couple quotes about his theory of value and what he says about it in this book. And that, again, those are the building blocks upon what a lot of Austrian economics is built upon, what a lot of classical economics is built upon. And so I think it's really important understanding how we value things in our economy, how price functions and such. And he really has a great way of explaining that, which is delved into a lot deeper in my blog post. And of course, if you end up picking up a copy of Principles of Economics, you'll understand what I'm talking about. So he says, the measure of value is entirely subjective in nature. And for this reason, a good can have great value to one economizing individual, little value to another, and no value at all to a third, depending upon the differences in their requirements and available amounts. And then a little later, he kind of reaffirms this, saying, the determining factor in the value of a good, then, is neither the quantity of labor or other goods necessary for its production, nor the quantity necessary for its reproduction, but rather the magnitude of importance of those satisfactions with respect to which we are conscious of being dependent on command of the good. This principle of value determination is universally valid, and no exception to it can be found in human economy. So it is really what it is worth, what the average of what is worth in terms of price to various individuals. And we see that commodity and money are based upon the theory of value as well, and commodity specifically and money on the marketability of a particular good. And so this is just a really fundamental economics textbook that I would recommend for sure if you're interested at all in Austrian economics. And I also would recommend Liberalism by Ludwig von Mises and Basic Economics Economics in One Lesson. Sorry, Basic Economics is by Thomas Sowell. But Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt is just an excellent volume, which just follows the one lesson of economics, which is that destruction cannot be beneficial, and that just because we take resources from one place or subsidies, etc., and put them in another, people make the flaw of not seeing what would happen if the goods had been used otherwise as they would have been used, and just to see what actually did happen. And so this is another really great volume talking about why Hazlitt is against various government regulations in the economy. So highly recommended, because this is probably the more practical of the two, but Menger is definitely excellent as well. I believe that libertarian and Austrian thinkers have a lot to offer about private property and about individual rights and about justice and so many important subjects to us. And I hope you've learned something today and are encouraged to look deeper into some of these thinkers, Bastiat, Menger, and Mises and Hazlitt, and even into some of those that I would call honorable mentions that didn't make it here, not because they're not as good as the other people, but only because I didn't have the time in this video to dive into all of that. But Rothbard and Lysander Spooner and John Locke and others who are influential to libertarian political thought, which is important in the whole scope of political thought, even though it might not be as mainstream as conservatism or liberalism. And in this sense, that I really just hope to leave a little piece of my heart with you guys, because this is something that I definitely have done a lot of study on, a lot of thinking on. I consider myself a libertarian, and I know I'm not going to convince anyone necessarily in one video, nor is that my goal. This is technically to be more educational about it. But I hope that you guys will read that blog post because it does go a little bit more in depth, and check out some of these thinkers. And stick with me on the next video. We'll be back into some cool art. See ya.